The sun had just started to rise, spilling soft golden light over the quiet streets of a small town. The streets were calm, the kind of calm that made the whole town feel like everyone knew everyone else. On one of those streets, an elderly man, 72 years old, was making his morning walk. He was not in a rush. He had never been a man who hurried. Life, he believed, had a rhythm and every step had its place. He was a retired school teacher. For decades, he had taught children in the same town, teaching them math, history, and most importantly, lessons about respect and kindness. His former students often remembered him as the man who would listen carefully, who would ask about their families, and who would make them feel important in a world that sometimes moved too fast to notice anyone. Even now, long after his retirement, people still greeted him warmly when he passed by. That morning, he wore his usual clothes, a light brown jacket over a simple shirt and trousers, a comfortable pair of shoes that had walked many streets in his life. He carried a small cloth bag with a few groceries he had bought earlier from the corner store. Nothing in his appearance suggested that he was going to have a day that would shake him in ways he never expected. The town itself was waking slowly. A few cars drove by, their tires humming softly over the asphalt. Birds sang from the trees lining the sidewalks. A newspaper boy on his bicycle shouted the morning headlines, though no one seemed to pay much attention. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from a nearby bakery. Everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. The man enjoyed these moments. He often walked to the park, sitting for a while on his favorite bench under an old oak tree. He liked watching the world wake up. He liked seeing people greet each other, neighbors chatting across fences, children running off to school with their backpacks bouncing. The world, he thought, had beauty in its ordinary mornings. As he walked, he noticed a few familiar faces. Mrs. Thompson from down the street waved at him, and he waved back. Two young men were fixing a bicycle outside a garage, nodding politely as he passed. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything seemed safe. He turned onto another street, one he didn't usually take, but today he felt like exploring a little. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the joy of walking. He liked seeing different parts of town he didn't visit often, noticing the small details, the way the sunlight hit a window, the sound of leaves brushing against the sidewalk, the smell of fresh paint on a nearby fence. Then, without warning, the ordinary morning started to change. Two police officers, sitting in a patrol car at the corner, noticed him. It was unclear why they paid particular attention. Perhaps it was just that he was walking alone, or maybe something in their eyes saw him differently. Before he could even realize it, the car pulled up slowly beside him. The engine hummed and the windows rolled down. "Good morning, sir," one officer said, but the tone was sharp, almost questioning, as if he already doubted the man's right to be there. The man stopped, instinctively straightening his posture. He looked at the officers calmly. He had faced many challenges in life, but he had never been rude to anyone. He believed that a respectful word could often solve more than anger or fear. "Good morning, officers," he replied politely, his voice steady. "Is there something wrong?" There was a pause. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. The older officer, who had been silent until now, gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just checking around," the officer said. "We've had some complaints about people loitering in this area." The man raised his eyebrows slightly. "Loitering?" He had not been loitering. He was walking. He had a purpose. Still, he chose to respond calmly. "I'm just taking a walk, officers." Nothing more. But the officers didn't seem satisfied. They started asking questions that made little sense, questions that seemed designed to unsettle him. "Where do you live? What are you doing out here so early? Do you know the rules about this neighborhood?" The man answered each question politely, keeping his tone calm and steady even as he felt a growing tension. He had faced prejudice before in his life more than once, but he had always believed that responding with dignity was better than responding with anger. Some people walked by, noticing the interaction. A few slowed down, unsure if they should get involved. The world often taught lessons in quiet ways, but sometimes those lessons came at moments when no one expected. As the officers continued to question him, one of them made a comment that caught him off guard. It was a remark that implied suspicion based not on his actions but on the color of his skin. The man stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had learned over the years that anger could cloud judgment, and he refused to let this situation steal his peace. He remained calm, though the words cut deeper than any physical insult could. He answered politely, maintaining eye contact, showing them that he was not afraid, but also not confrontational. There was power in quiet dignity, he knew, and he relied on it now. The younger officer fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable with the silence that followed his words. The older officer, however, leaned slightly closer as if trying to intimidate him. But the man didn't move. He stood there firmly, showing that years of experience, of living through hard times, had taught him resilience. After what felt like an eternity, the officers seemed to realize that he would not react in the way they expected. He didn't lash out, didn't argue, didn't run. He simply stood there, composed, patient, and firm. Finally, they muttered something about checking their other patrols and drove away slowly, leaving him alone on the street. The man exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from his body. The morning, which had started peacefully, had been interrupted by an encounter he did not deserve. But he refused to let it define him or ruin his day. He continued walking, though his steps were heavier, carrying a mix of relief and lingering frustration. As he walked, he thought about the world he had lived in for over 7 decades. He had seen changes, some good, some not so good. He had seen progress, but he had also seen moments that reminded him of the work still needed. The incident with the officers was not new in the world, but it was personal now. It reminded him of the quiet strength needed to navigate life with dignity and patience. He reached the park eventually, sitting on his favorite bench under the old oak tree. The branches stretched out above him, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft patterns on the ground. He watched the children playing from a distance, their laughter filling the air, and he felt a sense of calm returning. Yet, even in this calm, he knew that something had shifted. The encounter with the officers had sparked a determination within him. He wasn't angry, not in the way some people might expect, but he felt a quiet resolve forming. He knew that ignoring injustice entirely often allowed it to continue. There were ways to respond without losing dignity, and he would find that way. For now, he sat quietly, observing the world around him, letting the morning settle into a rhythm again. The birds sang, the children laughed. The bakery's smell still drifted on the breeze, and life went on. He would think carefully about his next steps, but he was certain of one thing. He would not let fear or prejudice control him. And as he sat there, the townspeople who noticed him felt a subtle admiration. They had seen him face life with patience, kindness, and strength, and even in a world that sometimes seemed unfair, he remained a figure of dignity and wisdom. The morning had tested him, but it had also reminded him, and perhaps others, that true strength often came in quiet, unassuming ways. This was only the beginning of what would be a remarkable day, a day that would show that courage and wisdom are not measured by size or age, but by the choices one makes in the face of injustice. The man finished his walk in silence, already planning the steps he would take to ensure that respect and fairness were not ignored in his town. The morning had started with a quiet tension, but as the elderly man walked away from the first encounter, he could still feel the officer's eyes on him. Even though they had driven away, the unease lingered like a shadow, following his every step. His heart, though calm on the surface, carried the weight of someone who had faced moments like this too many times before. It wasn't the first time he had been judged unfairly, but at 72, he had thought he would have seen the world grow kinder. He decided to continue his walk toward the town center, hoping the busy streets would help him forget the unpleasant encounter. The bakery, with its warm smell of bread, greeted him first. Children and parents stood outside, laughing and talking as the early morning sun illuminated the shop windows. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to enjoy the small comforts of ordinary life. But the sense of peace was short-lived. As he approached the corner near the post office, a patrol car slowed down again. His stomach tightened. The same officers from earlier stepped out, their expressions harder, sharper than before. The younger one, clearly impatient, glared at him as if daring him to react. The older officer's lips were pressed into a thin line, his eyes cold and calculating. "Morning again, sir," the older officer said, his voice clipped, almost mocking. "Mind if we ask you a few more questions?" The man's hands tightened slightly around his grocery bag. He had always believed in speaking calmly, in responding with respect even when others did not. But he also knew he had to protect himself, and sometimes words alone were not enough. "I'm just walking through," he replied, his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. Can I help you in some way?" The officers didn't seem interested in answers. They circled him slowly, making comments about why an older man like him would be out so early, implying he had no business being in certain parts of town. Every word, every glance carried an undercurrent of prejudice, subtle but unmistakable. People began to notice. Some paused on the sidewalks, uncertain whether to intervene. A woman carrying her shopping bag stopped at a safe distance, her eyes wide with concern. A young man leaned against a lamppost, quietly recording the scene on his phone. The elderly man was aware of the witnesses, but he did not let it change his demeanor. He kept his back straight, his head high, showing that he was not afraid. The younger officer stepped closer, his voice louder now. "You don't belong here. Why are you walking in this neighborhood? Who are you meeting?" The man shook his head slightly. "I live here. I am just taking my morning walk. I have done nothing to bother anyone." The older officer snorted, clearly annoyed by the man's calm response. "We've had reports. You know how it is. We need to make sure everyone follows the rules." Rules. That was the word that had always been used to justify unfair treatment, to mask prejudice with authority. The man's mind raced. He had seen it too often. The officers were not concerned about safety or rules. They were acting on assumptions about him, assumptions about his skin, his age, and the way he carried himself. He could feel the tension building in the air. The officers were trying to provoke him, to get some reaction that would give them an excuse to act harshly. But he had learned patience over a lifetime. Anger, he knew, could be used against you. Calmness could be a shield. Still, there was a limit. The man looked at them steadily. "I am 72 years old," he said, his voice firm now, "and I have lived in this town all my life. I respect the law and I respect people. I do not deserve to be treated like this for no reason." The words seemed to catch the officers off guard, not because of their truth, but because of the authority in the man's voice. He spoke without anger, without shouting, yet with a quiet force that made it clear he would not be intimidated. The younger officer's face twisted with frustration. He muttered something under his breath, a remark meant to demean, but the man did not react. He had learned that dignity often came from silence as much as from speech. A small crowd had gathered by now, some watching quietly, others whispering among themselves. People had seen older members of the community harassed before, and they knew the feeling of helplessness when authority is misused. But seeing this man stand tall, facing the officers without fear, created a subtle sense of hope. The man realized that this was not just about him. It was about sending a message, not in anger, but in the power of composure and truth. He decided that words alone might not end the harassment, but action would. He thanked the officers politely and continued walking, keeping his eyes forward. But the officers followed, their car moving slowly beside him. The man reached for his phone in his jacket pocket, not to call anyone in panic, but to make a calculated decision. He dialed a number he had used before in community matters. Someone he knew respected both the law and the people. The person on the other end listened as he described the incident calmly, including the officer's aggressive tone and their unfair questioning. He did not shout. He did not accuse recklessly. He simply stated the facts calmly, clearly, and with the authority of a man who had seen life, understood it, and demanded fairness. Meanwhile, the officers in their car began to notice that the man's demeanor had changed. He was no longer just compliant. There was a sense of confidence in his steps, a quiet power in his posture. They felt for the first time a hesitation, an unfamiliar feeling of accountability. As the call continued, he calmly described the events of the morning, how he had been approached without cause and how he had been questioned aggressively. The person on the other end promised to look into the matter immediately and assured him that the officer's behavior would be addressed. Hanging up the phone, the man felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. He had taken action and he had done it with dignity. But the officers were still there, parked across the street, watching. He knew that they would now face scrutiny and he welcomed it, not with malice, but with the belief that accountability is a necessary part of life. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse slowly, whispering about what they had witnessed. Some expressed admiration for the man's calmness. Others shook their heads at the officer's behavior. In that moment, the elderly man realized that his actions had done more than protect himself. They had also inspired those around him to believe that standing firm in truth and dignity mattered, no matter the age or size of the person facing injustice. He continued walking to the park, his steps measured, his mind clear. He reflected on the power of calmness, the importance of speaking truth, and the strength that comes from experience. Age, he thought, brought wisdom, and wisdom, when combined with courage, could change the outcome of even the most unfair situations. By the time he reached his favorite bench under the old oak tree, the tension of the morning had not entirely vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer fear or frustration. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had responded correctly. He had faced injustice with patience and clarity, and he had taken steps to ensure that it would not continue unchecked. The children in the park played as he sat, the sunlight filtering through the branches above. A gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and flowers, mixing with the faint aroma of the nearby bakery. The world seemed peaceful again, but the man knew that peace sometimes needed to be defended, not with violence but with action, with words, and with the courage to demand fairness. And so he sat thinking, planning, and breathing in the quiet strength of a life lived with dignity. The officers had harassed him, yes, but they had underestimated the power of composure and respect. They had not considered that a 72-year-old man, calm and wise, could turn their arrogance into accountability with nothing more than his voice and a phone call. As the morning moved toward noon, he remained on the bench watching life around him, but also preparing for what would come next. The story of this morning would not end with the officer's departure. It was only the beginning of a lesson in courage, dignity, and the quiet power of speaking up. Even in his age, he understood that one person could make a difference. The crowd, the town, the witnesses, they all saw a small part of it. But he knew the truth. Fairness and justice often start with one calm voice refusing to be silenced. And in that moment, he felt ready. Ready to continue his day, ready to ensure that the lesson of the morning would not be forgotten, and ready to face whatever came next with the same quiet courage that had carried him through 72 years of life. The elderly man returned home after his walk, carrying not just the groceries, but also the weight of the morning's events. He placed his bag on the kitchen counter and sat down at the small wooden table near the window. Sunlight spilled into the room, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to enjoy the familiar comfort of home. The smell of coffee brewing, the quiet ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat quietly, reflecting on what had happened. The officer's words still echoed in his mind. The suspicion, the subtle hostility, the way they had tried to make him feel out of place, it all lingered. But he did not feel fear, only a determined calm. He had faced injustice before, and he had learned that the best way to respond was with clarity and action, not anger. He thought about the many years he had lived in this town. Over 72 years he had witnessed both kindness and cruelty, progress and setbacks. He had seen prejudice in many forms, and he had learned how dangerous it could be when it went unchecked. The morning's incident was not just about him. It was a reflection of a problem larger than one street, one patrol, or one encounter. It was a reminder that fairness required courage, and courage required taking the right steps. Reaching for his phone, he thought carefully about who to contact. He needed someone who could listen, someone who respected both the law and the people. He didn't want to react out of anger or seek revenge. He wanted accountability, fairness, and most importantly, a resolution that would ensure no one else faced the same unnecessary harassment. He dialed a number he had saved years ago, someone with a reputation for integrity and respect in the community. The call connected quickly. He spoke clearly, calmly, describing the events in detail. This morning, 2 officers approached me while I was walking. They questioned me aggressively without cause and made me feel unwelcome in the neighborhood I have lived in my whole life. I believe this behavior was unfair and discriminatory, and I hope it can be addressed. The voice on the other end listened carefully. There was no interruption, no disbelief, only attention and understanding. The elderly man continued, giving specifics, where the officers had stopped him, what they had said, and how he had responded. He spoke with dignity, without shouting or showing frustration. but with a quiet firmness that made it clear he would not be ignored. After he finished, there was a pause. Then the voice responded, promising to investigate immediately. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," the person said. "We will ensure that this matter is looked into carefully. No one should be treated unfairly, especially not someone who has served this community for so many years." Hanging up the phone, the elderly man felt a sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the situation was far from over. The officers were still out there, unaware that their actions were now under scrutiny. They had assumed power, but they had not considered that accountability could come swiftly and without warning. He spent a few minutes in silence, sipping his tea and listening to the quiet sounds of his home. The tension in his shoulders slowly eased, replaced by a sense of purpose. He knew that the next steps were crucial. He could not control how the officers would respond, but he could control his own actions. He could ensure that fairness and justice were not ignored, and he intended to do so with the same calm dignity he had always practiced. Meanwhile, across town, the officers were beginning their own morning routines, unaware that the situation was no longer simple. Their supervisor had received a call from the man, and now questions were being asked about the incident. A quiet tension began to build in their office. The younger officer fidgeted in his chair, unsure how to respond, while the older officer, who had always prided himself on authority, felt a strange unease. They were being watched, evaluated, and held accountable in a way they had not anticipated. Back at home, the elderly man took a short walk around his garden, letting the fresh air and the scent of flowers clear his mind. He reflected on how small actions, when guided by courage and dignity, could create ripple effects. The officer's harassment had been a test, but it had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate the power of patience, truth, and measured action. As the day progressed, the man received a follow-up call from the authority he had contacted. The voice on the line was calm, professional, and firm. "We are looking into the matter," the person said. "The officer's behavior is being reviewed and steps will be taken to ensure fairness. Your concerns are valid, and we appreciate the way you handled this situation." The elderly man nodded even though the person on the line could not see him. He appreciated the acknowledgement, but he remained aware that real change required more than words. It required the officers themselves to recognize their actions and face the consequences. It required the community to remain vigilant, to support fairness, and to understand that no one, regardless of age, deserved harassment. By late morning, news of the incident had begun to spread quietly. Witnesses who had seen the officers approach him shared their observations with friends and neighbors. Some mentioned how composed the elderly man had been, standing tall despite the aggressive questioning. Others expressed surprise that someone so calm and polite could command attention and accountability so effectively. The story, though small, began to resonate. The man remained at home, reflecting on these developments. He thought about his family, his friends, and the children he had taught over the years. He realized that the lesson he was teaching now through his actions was one of dignity, courage, and the power of speaking up. It was not about confrontation or anger. It was about showing that fairness could be demanded without losing humanity, that respect could be maintained even when others acted unfairly. In the afternoon, he received a message confirming that the officers had been called into the station for questioning. The younger officer seemed nervous, shifting uncomfortably as he recounted the morning's events. The older officer, used to authority, now faced a rare experience, being questioned about his conduct. It was a small but significant moment, a sign that actions, no matter how small, could have consequences. The elderly man smiled quietly to himself. He did not feel triumph or joy in others' discomfort. His satisfaction came from knowing that fairness was being restored, that justice, even in a small town, had a chance to prevail. He understood that life often presented challenges, but it also offered opportunities to respond with wisdom and integrity. As evening approached, he settled into his favorite chair by the window. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, the day slowly giving way to night. He watched as people returned home, as children played in their yards, as neighbors greeted one another. The town seemed ordinary, calm, and peaceful once again. But beneath that calm, a subtle shift had occurred. The officers had learned that their actions were being watched, that they could not act without accountability. The community had seen that one person, even at 72, could stand for fairness and dignity, inspiring others to believe in justice. He reflected on the morning's events and his actions. He knew that courage did not always require grand gestures. Sometimes it was the quiet choice to remain calm, to speak truthfully and to take measured action. Sometimes it was a simple phone call that could change the course of events. The world, he realized, often responded to integrity more than it responded to fear or aggression. As night fell, the man prepared for bed, his mind at peace. The day had tested him, but he had faced it with composure and wisdom. He had demonstrated that even in the face of prejudice and unfair treatment, it was possible to act in a way that upheld dignity and demanded accountability. He had turned a moment of harassment into a lesson for the officers, the community, and himself. Before sleeping, he thought about tomorrow. The officers would face their consequences. The community would remember his calm courage, and life would continue. But the lesson of the day would remain. Fairness requires courage, dignity creates power, and one voice, spoken calmly and clearly, can make a difference. In the quiet of his room, he smiled gently. He had lived 72 years learning how to navigate life with respect, patience, and integrity. Today had been another chapter in that long journey. It was a reminder that age did not diminish strength, that wisdom could guide action, and that even in a world that sometimes seemed unfair, it was possible to respond in a way that was both powerful and humane. And as he drifted into sleep, he knew that the morning's events were only part of a larger story, a story about fairness, accountability, and the quiet courage that could change hearts, minds, and actions in a world that sometimes forgot the value of respect. The next morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky, and the town seemed calm once again. But beneath that calm, a quiet tension was growing. The officers who had harassed the elderly man the day before were now feeling the weight of accountability. Their actions, which they had assumed would pass without notice, were now being carefully examined. Their supervisor had already begun asking questions, and whispers of the incident had spread through the police department. The younger officer sat at his desk, fidgeting with a pen, his mind racing. He had never expected a simple morning patrol to become such a serious situation. The elderly man's calm composure and his measured actions had caught them off guard. The younger officer felt uneasy, realizing that the arrogance they had displayed could no longer hide behind authority. The older officer, who had always been confident and commanding, now sat quietly in the station, his pride shaken. He reviewed the morning in his mind repeatedly, trying to find justification, but the truth was clear. They had acted unfairly. The thought of facing consequences for the first time in his long career was uncomfortable, humbling even. For the first time, he realized that authority alone did not grant immunity. Actions had consequences. Meanwhile, the elderly man, now at home, began his day with his usual routine. He drank his morning tea and looked out the window, observing the quiet streets. Life was moving on outside, children walking to school, neighbors chatting, cars passing by. Yet the events of the previous day remained in his mind. He had taken the necessary steps, made the right calls, and now he waited to see the outcome. He reflected on the power of patience and dignity. It was not enough to respond to harassment with anger. That would have played into the officer's hands. Instead, he had chosen calm, clear action. He had documented the events, spoken to the right people, and ensured that accountability would follow. That approach, he knew, would have a far greater impact than any immediate confrontation could have. By mid-morning, the officers were called into a formal meeting with their supervisor. The atmosphere was tense. The supervisor's expression was serious, and the room was silent except for the sound of papers shuffling and chairs creaking. The officers were asked to recount the events of the previous day. The younger officer spoke first, his voice hesitant, realizing that his actions would be scrutinized in ways he had not anticipated. The older officer followed, his pride making him defensive at first, but soon even he realized that denial was pointless. The facts were clear, and witnesses had already corroborated the elderly man's account. The supervisor listened carefully, taking notes and asking precise questions. There was no yelling, no aggression, only a firm, professional expectation that they would answer truthfully and reflect on their behavior. Outside the station, word of the meeting began to circulate. Neighbors who had seen the incident shared the story with friends and family. People spoke of the elderly man's composure, his courage, and the way he had handled the situation without fear or anger. The story spread slowly, quietly building a sense of respect for the man who had faced harassment with dignity. Back in the meeting room, the officers were given clear guidance. They were informed that their conduct had been inappropriate, that it violated both departmental rules and basic principles of fairness. The supervisor emphasized that accountability was not punishment for its own sake, but a necessary step to maintain trust and respect between the police force and the community. The officers were asked to reflect on their actions and report back on how they would ensure such behavior would not happen again. The younger officer nodded quickly, relieved that there was a clear path to redemption, while the older officer, though silent, seemed to absorb the gravity of the situation. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to understand that authority must be exercised with fairness and humanity. Meanwhile, the elderly man, still at home, began receiving calls from neighbors and friends expressing admiration for the way he had handled the situation. Some shared their own experiences of injustice, grateful that someone had shown how to respond calmly and effectively. Others expressed relief that the officers were now facing scrutiny. These conversations were not about victory or revenge. They were about community, respect, and the power of integrity. He reflected on the role of the community in shaping justice. While the phone call he had made set the process in motion, the support and awareness of others reinforced the message. Fairness, he realized, was strengthened when people stood together, when witnesses spoke truthfully, and when communities refused to accept harassment as normal. By late afternoon, the officers were informed of the next steps in their review process. They were required to attend training sessions focused on fairness, respect, and understanding bias. They would meet with community representatives to learn about the experiences of residents and to understand the importance of trust. It was a structured process designed not to humiliate, but to educate and prevent future incidents. The elderly man watched the sun begin to set, casting long shadows across the town. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not from seeing the officers disciplined, but from knowing that fairness was being restored. The morning's events had tested him, but he had responded with patience, dignity, and wisdom. Now the consequences of their actions were unfolding, and he could feel that justice, in its own calm way, was taking shape. That evening, as he walked through his garden, he noticed the little things that reminded him of life's simple beauty. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze. The leaves rustled softly and the sky turned from gold to deep blue. Life continued even as lessons were being learned and accountability enforced. He felt a connection to the town, to the people who had witnessed the events, and to the larger truth that actions, both fair and unfair, always have consequences. He thought about how change often starts with small acts. One phone call made calmly and with respect could shift the course of events. One person, even at 72, could influence fairness, demand accountability, and inspire others to stand for what is right. The officer's behavior had been wrong, but the response had been measured, thoughtful, and effective. That, he realized, was true power. As night fell, the town seemed peaceful again, but beneath the surface, lessons were being learned. The officers were reflecting on their actions. The community was aware of its role in accountability, and the elderly man in his quiet home had demonstrated that courage and dignity were not measured by size, age, or authority. They were measured by the choices one makes when faced with unfairness. Before going to bed, he looked out the window one last time. The stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of light in the dark sky. He felt a sense of calm fulfillment. The events of the past 2 days had tested patience, courage, and integrity, but they had also shown that justice could be pursued with respect and wisdom, that even small actions could create meaningful change, and that a person's character could command respect in ways that fear and aggression never could. He understood that life was not always fair, but fairness could be demanded and respect could be maintained, even in difficult circumstances. He had acted thoughtfully, not out of anger, but out of principle. He had shown that age and experience were strengths, not weaknesses, and he had ensured that the officers who had tried to exert power unfairly would now reflect on their actions and learn a lesson that could not be forgotten. As he finally turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, he felt a quiet peace. The day had been challenging, but it had also been a moment of triumph. Not a triumph over others, but a triumph of dignity, integrity, and courage. It was a reminder that even in a world that sometimes acts unfairly, one person can influence change, inspire respect, and uphold justice through thoughtful, calm action. And as he drifted to sleep, he knew that the story of the morning's events would not be forgotten. The officers would carry the lesson forward. The community would remember the importance of standing for fairness, and he, with his quiet strength and wisdom, had shown that true courage lies not in confrontation, but in patience, clarity, and the unwavering pursuit of what is right. The town awoke to another bright morning, calm and familiar, yet carrying a subtle sense of change. The events of the past 2 days were still on the minds of many, especially those who had witnessed the incident with the elderly man. Conversations in shops, cafes, and parks often drifted toward what had happened, not in a gossipy way, but in a thoughtful, reflective manner. People spoke of fairness, respect, and the courage it takes to stand up calmly in the face of injustice. The elderly man, now in his home, started his day slowly, as he always did. He made tea, placed a few pieces of toast on a plate, and sat by the window, watching the town come alive. He was a quiet observer, but his mind was alert, reflecting on what had happened and how it had changed things. There was a sense of peace in knowing that his calm and measured actions had made a difference, not only for himself but for the community as a whole. Overnight, the police department had taken the necessary steps. The officers involved had met with their supervisors and community representatives, engaging in discussions about their conduct and learning about the impact of their actions. The process had been serious and reflective, emphasizing understanding and accountability rather than punishment alone. By the morning, reports were being prepared to ensure proper follow-up, and the message was clear. Harassment would not be ignored. Outside, neighbors walked to work, children played in yards, and familiar greetings filled the streets. Some people nodded at the elderly man as he stepped outside for his morning walk, their smiles carrying a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. There was a newfound respect for him, not because he had sought recognition, but because he had shown patience, courage, and wisdom in the simplest yet most powerful way. As he walked through the streets he had known for decades, he noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere. People were more aware, more careful to treat one another fairly, and more willing to speak up when they saw injustice. The story of the previous days had reminded them all that one person, acting with dignity and principle, could inspire change. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and human, and that made it lasting. The elderly man paused at a small park, watching children swing and run along the paths. A young mother smiled at him, and he returned the smile warmly. In that moment, he realized that his actions had ripple effects far beyond the initial incident. He had not only addressed the unfair treatment he had faced, but he had also set an example of how courage, patience, and integrity could influence others, encouraging fairness and kindness in the everyday interactions of the town. He continued walking, passing the bakery and greeting the owner, who nodded with subtle acknowledgement. Even small gestures, he thought, mattered. Every person who witnessed fairness being demanded without aggression was reminded that respect was earned through actions, not fear. It was a lesson that the officers themselves were learning, quietly and privately, and that the community was beginning to understand as well. Later in the day, he received a brief call from the community representative who had been involved in the investigation. "Everything is proceeding well," the voice said. "The officers have met with the supervisors and are reflecting on their behavior. Your calm response and thoughtful approach have made a real difference. The department is committed to ensuring that fairness and respect are maintained going forward." He listened quietly, nodding even though no one could see him. "Thank you," he said softly. "I only wanted the right thing to happen. I wanted respect to be restored and for the community to know that fairness matters." After the call, he walked to a small cafe where he often met friends for morning coffee. Inside, familiar faces greeted him warmly and conversations flowed naturally. Some spoke of the incident, not to dwell on negativity but to reflect on what had been learned.